My name is Tara Brabazon.
And my name is Steve Redhead.
And we thought we'd get together today to rejuvenate some work that Steve and I did a couple of years ago. Would it be 2 or 3 years ago now, Dale?
About two and a half years ago.
When we were working in Canada at the University of Ontario. And Steve was doing incredibly innovative teaching and learning experiments in some ways in how we teach law using the digital environment. And we wrapped this project up in the phrase Law Live. And we've looked at Twitter and law and all sorts of paradigms. But today I particularly wanted to capture Steve's work on podcasting and the teaching of law, because Steve's done some remarkable podcasts in and around law and legal studies and also criminology. So Steve, if I was to ask the really obvious first question, how have you used podcasts in the teaching of law, and how can it be best used, do you think?
I certainly use podcasting, I think, productively, although I think there were some mistakes in the way that I used it, as a professor of interdisciplinary legal studies at UIT in Canada, with students who were pretty au fait with social media, but didn't necessarily see this as a normal part of their teaching. I actually think even before students start in a law school, you could actually use podcasting to get people interested in the courses that you're offering. So I think podcasting can be right across the board.
Yes, because there is that fascinating case study in the States, isn't there, Steve, of a medical school creating a podcast for admissions. So in other words, for students who are thinking of applying, the podcast helps them through the admissions and also provides information about, say, what would happen in an interview or what to expect. So it's that sort of use you're thinking of?
I am, and I don't know of any other law schools, either in Australia or the world, that have used it in that way, interestingly. It was a medical school that the study was about. But I think podcasting more generally in the courses is something that's well worth thinking about, particularly legal studies, interdisciplinary legal studies as it's now become known. And I think that's partly because a lot of complex work goes on in the law school which you can't necessarily capture in 2-minute 45 podcasts. I mean, you can do podcasts of 20 minutes or 30 minutes or 40 minutes for that matter. But actually the very brief podcasts, the really fast ones, are interesting for all sorts of reasons in legal studies. Partly you can look at, say, legal theorists in a new way, and I think podcasting can be used for that, and I certainly did that at UIT. But also I used it partly for the students' understanding of the development of themselves as legal scholars, and how they could, in their various assessments, develop their work, not just in a more traditional way of going to lectures, sitting there taking notes, which is certainly law students' bent, but actually podcasts looking at the ways, different ways in which they can learn about law and legal studies, and particularly the application of law enforcement, law creation, and so on. I think that there's all sorts of possibilities. Some of the things that I did at UIT I think were quite innovative, but I think we've got to learn more about this kind of social media and how we might use it in the law school.
Because, for example, Steve, you didn't use it, and I would argue, I think a poor use of podcasting is as a time shifting for lectures. I think that's poor. There are other ways to do it, and I just don't, go to a lecture or don't. Flip a classroom if you want to. I was very impressed by your usage of it, because you had a diversity of students in legal studies at UIT, and you did these very short podcasts of even 2 minutes on a theorist, so they would come into the lecture at least knowing the theorist's name, a bit of background, and something to think about before they arrive. So why did you do that?
I think particularly for law students who very often see themselves as potentially legal professionals and not necessarily needing to understand legal theory, for example, it allowed them to get into the subject of legal theory quite easily, quite quickly. Whereas they would have been more resistant to it if you just stood up and talked for 40 minutes in a lecture about a particular legal theorist. I was able to do that, and I did a really interesting program on legal theory in the contemporary world as a result of introducing them to even snapshots of theorists in the podcasts. And I think that's a way of, alternating, if you like, between really quite deep theoretical work around law and almost more biographical, more sort of journalistic work around celebrity intellectual theorists.
You also used podcasts in a remedial way, and you and I, in fact, did a podcast together because you found that your fourth-year legal studies students were lacking a lot of information literacy, and you actually gave them an information literacy, the development of an information scaffold first assignment. Yet in the middle of that, you realised, my goodness me, they don't have the expertise that you thought a fourth-year student would have. So we created that podcast as a band-aid, if you like, as a remedial scaffold. And you certainly got some fantastic feedback from students, I think particularly mature age students who were guided through that process.
Yes, I think that is interesting, that actually, social media is seen to be a young person's world, but actually a lot of the more mature students were the ones who used it and used it very effectively. They hadn't really been introduced to scaffolding and legal literacy, if you like, and I think particularly the more mature students who were coming back to university after working, they got a lot out of that, and they use social media like podcasts very well indeed.
The final question is a very moving and evocative question about the use of podcasts and sonic media more generally. You had a student who was blind.
Yeah.
That you taught law, and your and my politics is we want more people with impairments, more people on a disability journey in our universities. It's an imperative, it's very important, particularly in the professions. And how do you believe podcasting and sonic media can open out our universities to men and women with impairments?
Yes, I particularly remember teaching a very good student in Canada who had actually gone blind in his teens. He was a terrific student and used social media in general, particularly podcasts, very, very well indeed. But he attended lectures and worked assiduously. The interesting thing is he was able to use podcasts about legal theorists or about legal theory and really quite innovative developments in the course very well indeed. But he attended virtually all the courses too. He attended in person. So he was able to use all sorts of things that we were doing in the class, but also going away and listening to podcasts, which he did really intelligently.
And remarkably, he topped the course or came pretty close to it.
He was in the top 3 or 4.
So that's a remarkable usage. So it can be enacted for high-level theoretical work as providing, if you like, a primer going into a conventional lecture. You can flip the classroom with innovative strategies. You can provide the remedial work for information literacy on the way through when you realise the students don't have the expertise that you thought they would have, but also widen out politically what we're doing in a university. So men and women who perhaps before social media, before the domestication of hardware and software, before they could actually come into a university, they can be helped and indeed helped to succeed incredibly well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you can do that, whether you have totally online courses or courses which are a mixture of online and face-to-face.
The final question I'd ask you, Steve, about this is, obviously podcasts are used throughout the academy now, but are there particular elements that you think the teaching of law, legal studies, criminology gains specifically that perhaps other disciplines like medicine or cultural studies or education do not?
I think the one thing that I would say is that it makes the work more interdisciplinary. It allows interdisciplinarity to come into the law school in a much better way, certainly than when I started as a law student. And I think that means that you can actually introduce different kinds of perspectives, different ways of thinking, much more easily, much more quickly, through different aspects of social media. Twitter helps. My project on Law Live is still ongoing, and I think that's a really good way of looking at it. But also things like podcasts help too.
Steve, thanks so much. Really fascinating area. And this is transformative of the contemporary university, I think.